Today, we're going to get into one of the most incredible origin stories of any country out there, Australia. We're talking about its transformation from this remote, gritty penal colony into the independent nation we know today. It's a wild story of empire, sheer desperation, and unbelievable survival.
So here's the big question, right? How on earth did an entire continent, a massive, far-flung land, end up becoming the world's largest prison? I mean, it sounds like something out of a novel, doesn't it? But for the British Empire, this was a very real solution to a very pressing problem.
You see, this whole radical plan was basically born from a perfect storm of problems for 18th century Britain. You could almost call it a brutal but brilliant two-for-one deal. On one hand, they had this massive crisis at home with their prisons just overflowing. And on the other, they were an empire, always looking to expand their reach across the globe. Well, Australia became the answer to both.
To really get why they'd go to such extreme lengths, we first have to look at just how bad things had gotten back in England. It was a situation that was quickly becoming unsustainable.
Okay, so everything really boils down to one major event, the American Revolution. Before 1776, Britain had this convenient pressure valve. They'd just shipped tens of thousands of convicts over to their American colonies. Problem solved. But after America won its independence, that door slammed shut permanently. This created an absolute logistical nightmare. Prisons were overflowing, and they even had to use these old, rotting ships called hulks as floating jails. It was a crisis.
So with America out of the picture, Britain's leaders were scrambling for a new, pretty radical solution. And their eyes turned southward, to this newly charted land on the complete other side of the planet.
And once they decided, things moved with surprising speed. In 1770, you've got Captain James Cook charting the eastern coast. Then, just 18 years later, that's less than a generation, the first fleet of 11 ships shows up to start a colony. This whole system of forced transportation would go on to define the continent for the next 80 years.
Just try to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this plan. This was a voyage into the almost total unknown. It was an incredible roll of the dice on a continental scale that was either going to succeed spectacularly or just fail in the most catastrophic way imaginable.
So getting there was one thing. That was just the first hurdle. Now came the really hard part, figuring out how to actually survive in this new and often very harsh world.
Every great story needs a leader, and for this one, it was a guy named Captain Arthur Phillip. He was the one in command of that first fleet, and he was tasked with setting up the very first settlement at Port Jackson, which, we now call Sydney. The survival of this entire experiment rested squarely on his shoulders.
And this is what's so fascinating. The key to the whole thing was Phillip's leadership. He wasn't just some warden running a prison. He was a really pragmatic builder. He understood that in this completely new world, the old rigid British class system, well, it just wasn't going to fly. His approach wasn't just about being humane. It was a straight-up survival strategy.
I mean, think about what they were up against. They knew next to nothing about the land, the local seasons, or even the soil. So cooperation between the convicts and their guards wasn't a choice, it was an absolute necessity. Phillip made sure all the resources were shared equally, and this is crucial, he offered convicts a real path to redemption. That little bit of hope, that was the fuel that kept the whole enterprise from completely falling apart.
And you know what? Because of that hope, because of that practical leadership, it actually worked. The first settlement survived, which led to more settlements. And slowly, so slowly, the idea of Australia started to change. It went from being just a prison to a place where a whole new kind of community could actually be built. Let this number sink in for a minute. 160,000. By the time the last ship arrived in 1868, that's how many men and women had been sent from Britain. This wasn't just a policy, it was a mass migration that would forever shape the continent.
And here's the really important part. For many, the story didn't end when their sentence was up. A lot of former convicts got the chance to get their own land and join these new, growing communities. The lines between a convict and a settler started to get really blurry as former prisoners became farmers, builders, and citizens of this new society.
And then, two major events happened that just threw gasoline on the fire of Australia's growth. First, more and more free settlers started showing up, looking for a new life and new opportunities. But the real game changer? The gold rush of the 1850s. The discovery of gold triggered this massive wave of people and money that completely transformed the colonies almost overnight.
So now you've got this population boom, you've got money pouring in, and suddenly these separate little British colonies start thinking bigger.
They're becoming a dynamic, confident society, and they're ready for their final transformation into a single, unified nation.
You could see how the dominoes started to fall. The economic growth and the gold rush gave all these separate colonies a real reason to start working together. This sparked a movement to federate, which all led to the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia.
And this is it. This is the big moment. January 1st, 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia is officially born. This act of federation brought all the colonies together, creating a brand new nation with its own parliament and constitution, though it's worth noting, still very much a part of the British Empire.
The final legal piece of the puzzle came 30 years later. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 basically gave Australia full power to make its own laws. This was the moment it truly became an independent, sovereign nation, free to chart its own course, while still choosing to keep its historical ties to Britain.
So you go from a desperate solution to a prison crisis to a nation forged in some of the toughest conditions you can imagine. It's an incredible journey, and it leaves us with this final question to think about. How does a national identity that was born from exile, from punishment, and from the absolute necessity of survival, how does that continue to shape the character and the spirit of a country even centuries down the line?